This is my 1982 Mazda RX-7. As you can see, it is rather sad and gross. I don't really know what I want to do with it yet, but I guess we'll start by trying to make it go. Now, if you're only vaguely familiar with the RX-7 and in turn the rotary engine, you may assume that it was the first car with one. However, that is rather untrue. So Felix Wankel first had the idea for his rotary piston air compressor in the 1920s and got it patented later in the 1930s. But it wasn't until the 1950s when he was working at NSU that he started making prototypes to maybe put in a motor bicycle. You may wonder what this German engineer was doing in the late 30s and early 40s. The first car to get a rotary engine was the 1963 NSU Spider, but they were pretty bad and they blew up a lot. Now, Mazda came across the rotary engine sometime in the early 60s, and by 1968 they had made it into something that actually worked with the 1968 Cosmo Sport, and continued to refine it through the RX2, RX3, 4, 5, REPU, and the 929 briefly. Those were all fine, I guess. The first smash hit didn't come until 1978 with the RX7, but not this one, the SA22C, later revised into this, the FB. The first generation is actually 2 generations, but also actually 3 generations. Don't worry about it. And then the actual second generation, the best one, the FC, came in 1986, and later the big expensive one in 93, the FD. Fun fact, if you're watching this, you cannot afford an FD. I think we're all caught up. Now, you may have noticed this sticker. That means it was sold at an insurance auction at some point, and is also the reason why I have no idea where it came from, why it was parked, or how long it's been sitting. But since I got it from the guy who got it from that auction, that gives us the only clean thing about it, the title. So that's nice. Enough yapping. Guess we'll have a little tour. I did pop it. Well, that might be stuck. We'll just start inside. If you can believe it, the smell is actually quite bearable. So if you just keep your eyes closed and don't touch anything, it's not a terribly unpleasant experience. Even with that, I do think this is the worst interior I have ever started with. But if you're a returning viewer, you know that I like to start with cars that are well beyond saving to begin with. My first observations include the cheesecloth sunroof panel, the missing key in the ignition barrel that's hacked apart, the aftermarket temp gauge, that's a bad omen, the random pieces and detritus strewn around the hatch, the stereo that was probably stolen at some point, and the carpet that I peeled up a while ago to vacuum the water out. And then the dash pad, but that's honestly not that bad for an early FB. We'll just put the lower grille back there for now and have a look in the glove box. Oh, that's a little disappointing. Guess we'll have a look somewhere else. Speaking of the dash, behind this lovely original metal spoke steering wheel, we can see 168, maybe 1,000 miles. We'll talk about it later. The carbureted ones just don't blow up as much. It's not completely unbelievable that that might be the original mileage. And as much as I'd love to root around for treasures in the back there, another thing to note is the electric poppers for the fuel door and the hatch. So that will have to wait until there is a battery. But let's see how original that engine actually is. So I'm going to present this as if you've never actually looked at one before, because I think it'll be more fun that way. But first you may realize I haven't actually called it a Wankel engine, because it isn't really. Felix Wankel's design had a rotor and a housing that both spun on separate axes, and that was complicated and not very good. It wasn't until later when another engineer named Hans Paschke reworked the design so it used a stationary housing and an eccentric shaft to make the funny spinny Dorito motion. This worked a lot better and actually left the prototype stage and is the foundation of every production rotary engine since. Felix Wankel very much did not like this, and was quoted as saying, "You've turned my racehorse into a plowmare." But Felix Wankel, as you may have guessed, kinda sucked. Anyways, it was actually Hans Paschke's design, the KKM, that Mazda took and made their engine out of. As mentioned, the first production model was the 10A in 1968, and we have evolved until 1982 with the 12A. So resisting the urge to just throw a battery in it and try in the key, just like any engine that's sat for a while, it probably wants some lubrication. Even if you don't know quite what the metal bits spinning around in there are, there is still metal scraping on metal. So I will start by taking the spark plugs out and throwing some lube in there. But taking off the fan will give me some much needed room to get to that not crank bolt. I was already pretty certain it wasn't completely seized up, but that doesn't mean it's all good news. I could be mistaken, but that compression does not feel entirely even. We'll get to that later, but now with the shroud out of the way, we can also see the enormous factory oil cooler that these have. That's because the oil does almost as much work as the coolant. We might talk about that later. Now to get at some spark plugs, I do notice that these look alarmingly new. Oh, and they're not even tight either. Tremendous. And these are obviously just brand new, so that doesn't tell us anything, but at least they're not rusty. If you're unfamiliar, this flavor is called a massive electrode spark plug. That's what all Dorito machines use. Now each rotor has a trailing edge plug and a leading edge plug. The top ones that I just took out are the trailing edge plugs. And just like with piston rings, you can have carbon and or rust gumming them up. And especially with these, you can even completely lose compression because of that. So they enjoy a bit of Marvel Mystery Oil, or ATF, to help loosen up that carbon. I just found some ATF first, so that is the correct choice. So I'll let it chew on that, roll it over a few times, and then repeat. And with that little whistle, we can already hear that it's trying to make some compression. But I feel like it doesn't sound nearly as even as it should be. Of course, that could be stuck seals, or it could be a blown up engine. Guess we'll find out when we crank it. Well, that hasn't improved at all, but I guess it's time for an electron cube. Well, the fuel pump's at least making noise and some relays are clicking, but there is no crankage. Oh, probably for the best. That could have made a mess. Okay, bye. But this wire draped over the fender seems to go to somewhere involving the ignition switch. I wonder if that's the starter. Well, that mystery wire did go to the starter contact on the ignition switch, but it still didn't do anything. So starting with the easiest thing, because 1970s Japan, this has a block of fusible links here on the strut tower, and those original links weren't looking very healthy, so I have cobbled that together with some Volvo stuff, and still nothing, of course. So I'll watch that number, see if it's putting power to the starter. Well, that's key on. I don't know why there's 7.5 volts. I'll pretend it's normal. And crank, that's probably full battery voltage. Well, hopefully it's something easy at the starter, but I'm still going to have to go under the car. Well, I don't know why the output lug of the starter solenoid would have a wire going off to the rest of the car, but that's what I'm looking at. Guess I'll put some power straight to it and see if it goes. Oh, it goes. Well, given that, I don't really know what was broken, but I'll just bodge it, and it will be a problem for later. Bodge wire engaged. Let us see how the cranking sounds. Since we have a plug out of each rotor, if it's healthy, when it's cranking, we should hear 6 even pulses of each rotor face as they go past. And that sounds pretty bad. Now again, that could be stuck seals, it could be blown up, we will find out. But I guess we'll move along to seeing if there is some spark. That is certainly a spark. Now, as mentioned, with the leading and trailing spark plugs, there are 2 separate coils because the timing is slightly different between them. So in the interest of being thorough, I will also check a leading edge one. And referencing our hopeful combustion triangle, we can check off spark and put a question mark next to compression. But before we move on to fuel, I guess I'll have a look in the distributor, because that's just what you do. Now, if you're uninitiated, don't freak out at this Elton antenna looking ass distributor arm. That's what it's supposed to look like. It's also supposed to look rather clean, which it does. All I really wanted to do was make that Elton antenna joke, in case I don't get a chance later in the video. Now, if you've been here a while, you know I don't really get along with these Tarbinator devices. Oh, none of that's attached. That's nice. So I think I'll just feign confidence and see how far it gets me. But the choke and the throttle both move freely, so that's a start. Oh, there's a rather large hole here on the side of the intake for what I believe to be the anti-afterburn valve. I don't know if those are actually open to the intake runners, but since this is what was going to happen anyway, I guess I'll just delete it. Now that's a very quick and dirty solution, and there's a whole lot of other emissions equipment on this carburetor that can go away. But with the likelihood of this engine coming out altogether in the near future, that can be a problem for later. And immediately after installing that, I happened to look down here by the washer bottle and found that. So that's fun. Onto the carb itself, these Nicky units have a convenient little sight glass in each bowl, and somehow they look fairly clean and not all full of varnish. So I think I will begin by shoving some gas into the inlet and seeing if the bowls will fill. And in the bottle I have some gasoline with some two-stroke oil. For this application I have opted to use way too much two-stroke oil. Something absolutely happened. There's now juice in one bowl. Well, at least one needle and seat isn't stuck. Rather, it's not stuck closed. Well, at this point, I don't really have anything better to do than try cranking it. Do something, car. Very disappointing. Not even a cough. Oh, I should make sure there's oil in it, huh? I think next will be to check the timing. It's trying to do something. And by check, of course, I mean just jam the distributor a different way and see if anything happens. Nothing happens. Cool. Well, given what I'm smelling, I'm inclined to believe it's just flooded now. So I'm going to pull the plugs back out and see if it smells like it's pulling fuel, even though it already does. I don't know. Oh yeah, that's very wet. Well, at least there's two-stroke oil in it. Also, yes. I did notice a lot more fuel came out of the rear rotor. I'm just going to pretend I think that's fine. Guess the only thing left to check is the cam timing, or maybe compression. Probably could have done that first, huh? Well, we know the spark is happening at least vaguely at the right time. I'm going to pull the plugs out again and see if a bunch of gas comes out. And if it does, I know the carb just dumped all that gas I gave it straight down the intake. Oh, nice and wet again. Oh! I did that in the wrong order. I needed to touch it first. Well, I had run out of brain cells and daylight by the time I found my compression tester, so it's a new day. Also, the brake lights were on the whole time, but this shot looks cool, so that's nice. Anyways, to find out, I should have started here. We'll start with the front rotor. Now this is just a generic compression tester for a piston engine, so there are certain difficulties when using it on a rotary. Since we have 3 separate faces with their own seals on the rotor, we have 3 separate combustion chambers that are rotating past this hole. So it's not just the number that this reaches that's important, it's also the pulses of each rotor face we have to pay attention to. So when I crank this over, we'll see that needle jump with each rotor face, and then once it reaches wherever it's going to land, we need to pay attention to the pulse of the needle to make sure it's relatively even. And of course there's special testers you can get for a rotary, but of course I don't have that. Also the sound you hear is just my little 12-volt power supply, what's keeping the battery alive. Well, even if it was even, 30 PSI would be real bad. Well, let's see the rear one. Well, that's why it didn't go. Probably should have started here. But again, we still don't know if that's because the seals are stuck or if it's because they are exploded. So now to see if exploded, I'll stick my borescope down there and see if we can have a look at the apex seals. I will have to take the leading edge plugs out for this. Because the leading edge spark plug hole is much bigger in the side of the rotor housing than the trailing edge. I don't know, something compression math. Some Mazda engineer figured it out, don't worry about it. But it's also because of that difference that the spark plugs on later engines are different, leading and trailing edge. On a 13B you'd have NGK BUR9 EQ and BUR7 EQ. On a 12A, they are both BUR8 EQ. Well, I have the spark plug part numbers memorized for my FC. That should tell you something. There is a hole and a rotor behind it. Now to have a spin. That is one apex seal. See, it's nice and bright and shiny and looking at us. So that's probably good, I guess. Does look like there's a bit of poo-poo on the front of that one. Again, not folded over and exploded, but I am seeing the texture of that rotor face. There is a ton of carbon on there. Yeah, that's 3 evenly spaced apex seals. So they are still present. I feel like that should give me more than 0 compressions. Let's have a look at the front. This borescope with the little dingle wheel on it that moves the head is rather handy. Although I would like to know what in the absolute hell it thinks is 51 degrees today. Oh, that one looks pretty yucky. But again, yucky as in just dirty, like it's not evenly contacting the housing. Not yucky as in blowed up. So of course here we're only looking at the very center of the apex seal. There's a whole bunch more of it out there that could be broken. But since they all seem to be present, at least, I'm going to keep trying to free them up with some juice. For this activity I have a cocktail of ATF and some acetone, which don't actually mix. Now the best thing to do for these with stuck seals is to run it, get it real nice and hot, and take it to redline a couple times. But I'm sure you can see the problem with that method in this circumstance. I have no idea how I could possibly show this on camera, but I'm also going to try getting the scope in there with the little screwdriver and try poking at the seal to see if it'll move at all. That one did. Of course, we'd only need 2 to be stuck to have a completely dead rotor. And that one is not at all. Well, it's now the evening again. I have been feeding it the sauce all day and turning it over slowly, and I have no idea if anything has changed. I guess we can start by seeing if it sounds any different. solid maybe. Let's see what the gauge says. Put the leading edge plugs back in so they can get fouled up immediately by the ATF. Well, it definitely did something in the rear, but I still don't think it's going to run on that. Well, it brought some back. It might just be the ATF still sitting in there, but of course I'm going to try it again. Do something, car. So it is making a tiny bit of smoke, so I think it is combusting. I just think that whooshing is the combustion coming back out the intake, or just to the next face of the rotor. Not pushing the rotor is my point. But it is doing something slightly different, so I'm just going to keep trying, I guess. I found a can of seafoam. I'm going to try something stupid. And yes, liquids don't compress, but as demonstrated, it can't even compress air at the moment, so I think it'll be fine. On the off chance that it still somehow is carbon, I don't really have anything better to do right now. I'm just going to let that sit in there overnight. But to be completely TBH, I don't think it's going to run at this point. This may have turned into an engine autopsy. Even though the apex seals looked clean and intact, one thing that can happen is if some foreign material or a chunk of metal from the engine gets into the housing while it's running, the rotor can smash it into the rotor housing and crimp the apex over, locking the seal in place. And if it can't move and float against the rotor housing, no compression. Also, in case it still is carbon, since I do think it is combusting, just doing this for a while might generate enough heat to loosen it up a bit. But again, I don't think so. But I'm almost out of daylight again, so I think I'll just let it sit and think about what it's done. Well, after even more nothing happening, I went and got some actual Marble Mysterious oil and let it chew on that all night. And with that, I have a little pick. I'm just going to give each apex seal a little nudge. Well, that one doesn't feel like it's moving, but it does look like it's moving. That one is definitely moving. And that one is also moving. That is a definitive improvement from before, at least on the rear rotor. And that one is just barely moving. So based on that, maybe the rear rotor's the good one now. So I guess now I'll give it a crank to get the rest of that oil out of there, and we'll try another compression test. It might sound different, I have no idea. It's about 80 pounds. That's a ways off from a healthy engine, but that's a whole lot better than it was. Again, the pulses are the important thing there, but if only one rotor face fires, that's still technically running. Yep, the rear rotor is now the good rotor. That doesn't uncomplicate things. I guess do something, car. I really feel like it should kick at least a little bit with that 70 pounds on the rear rotor. I'm just going to put the timing somewhere else and see if it changes anything. That's even more different, but worse. Cool. Okay. I figured the plugs were all fouled up after that oil bath, and they were. So they have gotten clean, they are now back in. I put the timing back where I know it belongs, and I even threw in an extra coil set that I had. But while I had the plugs out, I did compression test it again, and it's a little worse than that last test, so there was definitely some oil left in there. And given that the best number I have seen is still critically low, I think this will be my last real attempt before this is just an engine autopsy. Well, it's not really a genuine will it run if I know the answer is going to be yes. Looks like we have that answer now. It's no. But don't worry, the video doesn't end there. We're going to find out why it doesn't run. That of course means taking the engine apart. That of course means taking the engine out. I guess I'll do that inside since it's raining now. But since I and it are already wet, I guess I'll give it a bath first. I think the lesson to be learned here is to not park cars where they're going to sink into the earth. But the lesson I have chosen to learn is that I need a bigger tractor. At least it made it in here under its own power. For a starter I thought was dead, I'm rather impressed. But now that it and I are both dry, it's time to take some bolts out. Much to the dismay of my lower back, the lift is occupied. Suppose we'll get into it. Here we can see the remains of the aptly named rat's nest. As you can imagine, the emission controls on these things was a bit nightmarish. There used to be a bunch of tubes and wires and solenoid valves here to run all the air control and anti-afterburn valves. Looks like most of that's gone. All those colorful connectors would have plugged into a similar vacuum solenoid valve. I won't pretend to have memorized what all that does. It'll be going away if this thing keeps a 12A. We'll see. Oh, and one of them comes over here to the cruise control. This rig had cruise control. Very fancy. There's coolant in the intake manifold, by the way. I remembered that halfway through, but then I was too lazy to move the camera to get the radiator hoses. Mazda, I would like to lodge a formal complaint about this heat shield bolt that goes directly into the exhaust manifold. The head is now a perfectly round circle. Hope I can just snap it off. Hooray. And yes, I'm sure this heat shield's supposed to come off before the intake. However, shut up. As you may have guessed, it is full of oil. Rather pre-smoke. If it would have gotten running, I'd have smoked out the whole neighborhood. And I wasn't thinking about it earlier when I mentioned it. 83 was the last year for this flavor of oil cooler. Later cars had the Beehive oil cooler that went back there on the oil filter pedestal. But that is an oil to coolant heat exchanger. In 86, they went back to this flavor. You'll love to see it. And now for the plucking operation itself. I have found it easiest to go in from the side. If you hadn't already noticed, this is technically a mid-engine car. The entire keg of the engine sits rearward of the front axle. That is the same noise I made. Now to begin the weirdness, you can use a regular old engine stand for a Dorito machine. You just have to set it up a bit funny. And as will soon be very obvious, this is a big sandwich and it comes apart from that end, so we mount it to the stand on this side. Also worth noting, here we can see the inlet and outlet and inlet for the oil cooler. On an engine with the Beehive cooler, we'd have a hard line between those two. And conveniently, this engine stand was already set up because there was a 13B on it. Inconveniently, I don't have a good place to put the 13B, so I guess it's just going to hang out for a while. Now to begin with a bit of a tour of the specimen. First thing you may notice is why it's called a keg, because it looks like that instead of a long block or a short block. On the business side of the engine, here we can see some holes. Those are the exhaust ports. We'll see some rotors going past if I spin it over. Up here are the intake ports. We will count 4 of them. There were 6-port engines. Those didn't come till later. Don't worry about it. Up at the front, we will see how the water pump is housed in its own separate nugget up at the top of the front cover. We'll get to that. Another thing we'll get to, this little dingle bop down here, that is the oil injection pump. It does exactly what its name would suggest. So this, referencing the throttle input from this lever here, will deliver some oil straight to the carburetor through these lines. And back here, behind the clutch and flywheel, we will see the big bolts what hold the sandwich together. Also in there, I see one of those little warranty washers that a junkyard will put on an engine to see if it's been overheated so they can void your warranty. That tells us that this engine has definitely been out before, and it's probably a second-hand unit from a wrecker. And that is some very dark and nasty looking oil. No big chunks of metal or glitter, but rotaries don't really do that. And the next step is the front E-shaft bolt, but we have to lock the flywheel anyway, so let's get the clutch off. Now, if you haven't been this up close and personal with a rotary before, I must caution you, you may be about to see something rather disturbing. Do you like it? Looks like it's been pretty hot, but I can still see a lot of the grinding marks from where it's been resurfaced. And for the big special nut, there is a big special wrench. Of course, it's torqued to all the torque. Oh. And now remember, the rear main seal seals to the flywheel, so there is going to be some thread sealant on that. Oh, and this is a special bolt, as you'll see. Maybe 12As don't have that. As mentioned, the oil does almost as much work as the coolant in a rotary. On a later engine, we'd have a thermal pellet back here, which is basically a thermostat for the oil that controls the flow through the E-shaft and rotors. Either 12As don't have that, or this one's just missing it. This front pulley is what bears on the thrust bearing, so it's just going to move the E-shaft without it in. Or I could just edit it to make it look like I did it in the right order. And here we see the rear stationary gear housing, which also holds the rear main seal. On the back of the flywheel, we'll see the cylinder that interfaces with that. Also back there, we'll see the notch cut out of the flywheel for the balancing. On a manual car, it's part of the flywheel. On an automatic car, we would have had a counterweight like this that the flex plate then bolts to. Also on an automatic car, we would have had an extra ear and bolt hole here on the rear iron. On a manual car, it's planed off and we just have that inspection cover for some reason. That just means you can bolt an automatic engine to a manual, but not a manual to an automatic engine. I don't know, I didn't come up with it. Now I know you're excited to see the Doritos, but there's a few more steps yet. Next is the oil pan, so we can get the front cover off. Oh, there's nastiness in there. What even are you? The oil metering pump can just hang out on here. Now we will see our timing chain. Obviously, not really. Here is the oil pump. That's a whole lot of flop. not great. Also, distributor drive gear, sprocket, and then the front counterweight. If we look inside the front cover, we'll see that's also what drives the oil metering pump. There's no point taking the sprocket off of the oil pump. It is more sensible to just take the whole oil pump off. If you've been here a while, you'll know this is one of my favorite chunks of engineering, a G-rotor oil pump. That just tickles my tism just right. Behind that counterweight, we will see the thrust bearing. That looks fine. There is another one behind that plate. And just like the rear main seal, this piece is also the front stationary gear. We will leave that in so I can spin it over. Also just noticed another one of these warranty washer things. They're meant to pry off or fall off real easily if it's been overheated. Oh, well that's good. Anyways, we can finally open up the sandwich. Well, straight away I see a big chunk of chrome and rotor housing missing right here. And keep in mind, up here is where the compression stroke is happening. So that's probably our catastrophically low compression number right there. We pick up the corners of the apex seals to keep them corralled. A nice thing to do is take the water jacket seal, lift the rotor up and wrap it around there to keep the apex seals where they're supposed to be. But both of those seals kind of fell apart. There will be two in the front as well, these dowels that double as oil passages. Well, you definitely shouldn't have to do that. I don't have enough hands. Well, that fight with the dowel pin kind of shot these seals all over the place. We'll probably find them. Not only now do I remember these dowels are threaded so you can pull them and not have to do that. Oh, but that's real nice and stuck, so it didn't matter anyway, and I knew what I was doing the whole time. Only one apex seal came out. We'll just set it aside and we'll talk about it later. So overall, less catastrophic than feared, but still very bad. At this point, it may as well have been completely catastrophic. So now we'll go through everything one piece at a time, again assuming that this is all new to you, because I feel like talking about it and you're already here. But what I won't explain is what actually makes these work as a 4-cycle engine. This animation should take care of that. And if it doesn't, some other background is required. We're not going to get into it here. Beginning with the side housings or the end irons. These are cast iron with some kind of steel inlay that is then chrome plated to make for the combustion chamber where the rotor rides. They are also hollow to make for some coolant passages around the inside to cool that combustion chamber. Here is the intake port. That rough cast surface on the inside tells us it has not been ported or ground out. The closest thing you can do to camming a rotary is porting it. Just by changing the size and shape of that hole, you can effectively change the lift and duration and whatnot. Now these don't tend to suffer too badly when a rotary blows up, because there's nothing directly smashing metal fragments into that surface. But what can kill them is overheating and corrosion. Just like on a block or a cylinder head, getting it too hot can warp it. And as you might imagine, you can check for that with a straight edge and a feeler gauge. I don't have any tolerances memorized or anything, but just for demonstrations purposes. I don't know, seems flat enough. That's a problem for later. So overheating will kill them very quickly in exuberant fashion. What will kill them very slowly in a much less exciting way is corrosion. Here we can see the beginnings of that where those corner seals have sat for a while. But what can really do a lot of damage is old coolant. Regular coolant sitting for many years can turn acidic eventually. Acids aren't very friendly to metals. These are a little more resistant, because they're cast iron, but that acid can do quite a lot of damage to the rotor housings. Since the bodies of these are made of cast aluminum or aluminium for import models, that corrosion can get pretty bad. We can see the beginnings of that with this white flaky aluminum oxide in some of these coolant channels. Not that it matters too much for these rotor housings, but that's not very advanced. So onto the housing itself, these also have a steel inlay around the inside that is then chrome plated to make up the epitrochoidal combustion chamber. These guys are what really get mangled when they blow up, as you may imagine. Here we can see some fairly normal wear as well as some fairly abnormal wear. These long ways marks around the outside of the chrome, that is fairly normal apex seal wear. What is a little less normal are these lateral lines or chatter marks. Now those are obviously bad for compression, but they're also even worse for the rotor itself. If that apex seal sits in there chattering back and forth in its groove, it'll eventually just beat that groove open, which will then make the chatter worse. And eventually that apex seal can just tumble out of the groove and then kaboom. 12As are a little less susceptible to that. It's more pronounced in later 13Bs when they went to the 3-piece apex seals, just because there's less meat there. But to make a coherent point out of all that yapping, that's why we have an oil injection system to keep those apex seals lubricated. Another reason 12As are less susceptible to that chatter is because the oil is mixed at the carb and atomized more completely with the fuel. That just makes for a much more even coating around the inside of the rotor housing. On the 13B, because EFI, they moved to a pressure oil injection system, and that little hole right there is fed by a mechanical injector up there. And that little hole could lubricate the center of the apex seal very well, but then it would let the corners run dry. So even later 13Bs, they moved to 2 pinhole injectors, which fed the corners very well, so the center could then run dry. So after that, nothing, because Ford is now a majority shareholder, and there's no more Rotary at all. Okay, tangent over, that's why premixing is important. So to circle back to coolant, here we will see a groove cut around the outside of the housing for the water jacket seal. And that's where the corrosion will kill it once that coolant turns acidic. But if you overheat it, that will also take out the seal that sits in there. These are some special O-rings, I guess. I don't know, they're a bunch of different colors. None of these came out in one piece, which is why I suspect overheating is what ultimately killed this thing. Supporting evidence, that aftermarket coolant temp gauge. I also noticed this engraving on the radiator indicating some kind of service in 03. So it more than likely had a chronic overheating problem, and that eventually claimed this engine. Onto the rotors. These are mostly cast iron with a special inlay for the rotor gear here, also the bearing pressed into the center. They also have lots of very specifically sized grooves cut in for the various seals. Such seals include the side seals, the corner seals, and the one everyone knows, the apex seals. But did you know that they all also have their own very specific springs? As mentioned, what kills these is poor lubrication and wear, causing that apex seal groove to become too wide. But the opposite can also happen. If another chunk of metal or foreign material gets into the combustion chamber while it's running, that will just smash it into the wall and slam that groove shut. And then the apex seal can't move. And if the apex seal can't move, it can't seal. And if it can't seal, there goes all your compression. And we arrive at this situation where the apex seal can't move and there's no compression. Lastly, a bit of a side note on the face of the rotor. Here we have a dish like you would have a dish in the face of the piston. Here on a 12A, we can see that those are not symmetrical, which is why the rotors are different front to rear. Here on a 13B rotor, we will see that that is symmetrical, meaning the rotors are the same front to rear, making them a little easier to mix and match and whatnot. That doesn't really matter, I just wanted to mention it. Now around on the side of the rotor, none of this stuff really likes to blow up, but it's still plenty expensive. As mentioned, these are the corner seals. Those also get stuck when the apex seal slams shut. These just have a little wire spring behind them that is not very sophisticated. They are also supposed to have a little rubber or something insert that's supposed to dampen the chatter motion of that apex seal. A lot of aftermarket corner seals you can get are solid without that little insert, because if you premix, it's not really a problem. The side seals, they have this little zigzag looking spring. The headache with these is that you have to shave down the ends of these when you install new ones to cope it with the edge of that corner seal. That's not a lot of fun to do. Further towards the center of the rotor, we have the oil control rings and their springs. It is also a fun zigzaggy shape. The center of this rotor has a bunch of oil splashing around for cooling and lube and whatnot, and that is open down to the sump in the bottom. So kind of like a piston engine, these oil control rings just keep that oil corralled and out of the combustion chamber. They are shaped kind of like a U and have a very special O-ring, special because it gets quite hot here. Fun side note, since in a rotary you don't have blow-by going straight down past piston ring gaps, you don't really have crankcase pressure. You also don't really have a crankcase, I guess. Finally, in the center of the rotor, there is the rotor gear. That's a separate piece that is pressed into the rotor on some isolator pins for dampening and whatnot, I guess. I don't know, I'm not about to take it out. And this gear set is the closest thing we have to timing in a rotary engine. That just maintains the clock angle of the rotor throughout its rotation around the eccentric shaft. I don't really have a better way to illustrate that relationship than this. That's the wrong way, it goes this way. And finally, ultimately, lastly, while we're here, the E-shaft. Those stationary gears also serve as the housing for the main bearings of the eccentric shaft. There are only 2 of them, which is plenty. Keep in mind there are no radial loads like in a piston engine. One nice thing is that all 4 bearings in a rotary are full sleeve bearings that are pressed into their housings. That means that spun bearings just aren't a thing with rotaries. It also makes it a lot simpler to set up your clearances when you're putting one together. The shaft itself, anyways, just like a crankshaft, is just a stick with a bunch of bearing journals on it. So called an eccentric shaft because these circles are eccentric from each other. In contrast to a crankshaft, those are oil squirters. Those shoot oil around the inside of the rotor to help cool it. Later engines would have had a check ball and a thermostatic device up here so that those were off during warm-ups. But here on the 12A, those are just on all the time, I guess. But to briefly sum up the oil system, it is fed at the main bearings, those then feed the rotor bearings and the oil squirters. It splashes around inside the rotor, controlled by the oil control rings, and eventually works its way down the center iron back into the sump. Well, that covers all the big chunks that make a rotary, in stock form at least. Now there's a lot of other things to talk about like porting and forced induction to make them a bit spicier, but I do hope you enjoyed this rather brief crash course on a rotary in stock form. Of course this was a tangent to begin with. There's still a whole car over there. And while that engine is a bit of a disappointment, I didn't really plan on keeping it anyways. This rig is pretty solid apart from some damage in the rear quarters and a little bit of rust, but no big patches of cancer like FBs usually get. As to what's gonna go in here, I have no idea yet. More than likely, some flavor of rotary. I already have 13B I could use, but I'm not completely opposed to a piston engine swap if I can find something small and light and rev happy enough. I can promise you it's not going to be a gigantic hulking boat anchor of an American V8. There are quite enough ruined FBs in the States with Ford 302s and Chevy 350s in them. But as I like saying so much, we'll get to it. There is a bigger project I need to finish first. So I guess to answer the question in the title, no, it didn't run, but we found out why. So I do hope you've enjoyed this video, found it entertaining, informative, something of the sort. If you did, please do some engagement down there. Maybe click subscribe and bell. If you really like my face and my voice, you can head over to Patreon and help support me. Thank you to my current Patreon members. I love you. But since we didn't get to hear this thing run, I guess we'll conclude by having a nice chill look at a Dorito machine that actually works. This has been Baked Beans Garage, and I am Chinchilla. I will see you next time. I usually walk away at the end. I'm still stuck here.